I hope you had a nice break and we're excited to move into our afternoon sessions here. I would like to turn the conversation over to Nicole Smith of Georgetown University, who will moderate our discussion on education and early career. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's certainly a pleasure to be here today. I am honored to be the moderator for a panel with such distinguished participants, Sharmili, Chandra, and Ben, three stalwarts in the research that supports the fight to advance gender equity, diversity, and inclusion in our institutions. This promises to be a riveting meeting. Coming off the heels of a pandemic recession that once was termed a she session, and where at one moment we were talking about all the things we're going to do for women, we've noticed the past few weeks a social spending plan that has whittled away paid family leave and medical leave, a staple of, for our European neighbors. And we've whittled that away from potentially 12 weeks to 4 weeks. I want to introduce our panel to talk about some of the implications for women and what we've done so far. First, I want to welcome Shamili Majmudar, who oversees women's employed development and implementation of strategic policy and systems change priorities, advancing economic justice for women. She heads the organization's advocacy efforts for the voluntary implementation of aspects of good quality jobs so employees can achieve economic stability, developing and leading WE's collaborative with employers. In partnership with employers seeking to advance gender equity, she also advocates for best practices on sexual harassment, equal pay, and other issues of gender bias that create barriers for women in the workplace. Welcome, Shamili. I would also like to introduce Chandra Childers. She is a study director at the Institute for Women's Policy Research. She's an expert on social stratification and social and economic inequality by race and sex. Chandra examines issues related to women and girls of color and job quality. Before joining IWPR, Chandra taught multiple undergraduate courses in sociology at Texas Tech University and the University of Washington. Courses taught include social programs, social problems, poverty and inequality, and research practicum. Chandra completed her PhD in sociology at the University of Washington. Her dissertation examined trends in racial occupational segregation by sex. And finally, our third panelist is Ben Gitis. He is an associate director for BPC's Economic Policy Project. Before joining BPC, Ben was the deputy director on a team that helped Howard Schultz, the former CEO of Starbucks, consider an independent run for president of the United States. Before that, Ben was the director of labor market policy at the American Action Forum, where he researched and wrote about paid family leave and the opioid crisis, minimum wage, and immigration legislation, among other things. Ben was a member of the American Enterprise Institute, Brookings Institution Working Group on Paid Family Leave, where he developed a model for estimating the cost of paid leave proposals. He also worked at the American Action Forum as a policy analyst, providing research assistance to former CBO Director Douglas Holtz-Eakin, and conducting his own original labor market policy research. So to everyone, welcome. The rules of the game are, our panelists will have each 10 minutes for discussion, and we welcome members of the audience to consider any questions they have for the panelists, and you can write them in the chat. I will provide those questions to the panelists after they've completed their discussion. So welcome, and we will begin with Shamili.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's a pleasure to be here. As you said, among a group of distinguished panelists, I'm excited about this conversation. Women Employed's mission is to improve women's economic status and to remove barriers to economic equity. We were founded in 1973, and we've worked to improve women's economic status through research and policy analysis, advocacy to bring about systemic change by improving public and corporate policy, innovative programs, and collaborative initiatives pursued with a wide range of organizations, including higher education as well as employers. We focus on building women's economic power in order to close the wealth gap at the intersection of gender and race. One note I would like to make is that when we talk about wealth, we are thinking of wealth as creating choices. While home ownership and building a stock portfolio are common ways we refer in our society to building wealth, we also think of wealth as the ability to make the most basic choices without creating a financial crisis. For example, the ability to pay for car repairs or a new refrigerator because yours is broken down. That those choices are also critical markers of wealth. It's no secret that a post-secondary degree increases earning. While home ownership and building a stock portfolio are common ways we refer. For low-income women who seek to improve their employment opportunities by advancing their education, the traditional college system can be really difficult to navigate. Many college programs are centered around students who are entering immediately after leaving high school, don't account for adult learners who may have been out of school for a while, or who may need to brush up on their basic math and reading skills. Those that we call non-traditional students are more likely to be working while they're going to school, dealing with erratic work schedules, more likely to be parents, and they require education and training programs that address their specific needs and adequately support them in attaining desired credentials, whether those be a degree or certifications. So we work with colleges and community organizations, providing resources and technical assistance to help implement curricula and seek policy improvements to bring programs to scale. For example, we work on bridge programs, which are specialized courses that help students build that basic reading, language, and math skills that they need to earn a GAD, while also preparing them for a chosen career. And for those students who don't know what field they want to go into or transition into, or lack the academic skills to build a bridge program, we work with local community colleges to pioneer something we call Career Foundations, which is an innovative course that helps non-traditional students explore their options, identify a future career, and learn what academic programs and how long those programs will take and how much they'll cost in order to get there. We're also working to improve policies and procedures that allow students to access financial aid by working with institutions with the Illinois Community College Board to develop a state-defined process for ability to benefit, which is a policy that allows students to access federal financial aid for career pathways programs. In Illinois, where Women Employed is located, Black and Latinx students are woefully underrepresented in public higher education. We have completion gaps, which mirror what we see nationally between Black and Latinx students compared to white students, as much as 30 points in some cases. And our Illinois public institutions are unfortunately among the most expensive for in-state residents. And those that receive most of the state appropriations enroll lower numbers of Black and Latinx students. Of course, the growing cost of education compounds the problem. The price tag of a college education in the US has more than doubled over the past generation, even though household income has only gone up by 14%. As many of you know, women hold about 2/3 of student loan debt in the US and take longer than men to repay those student loans. And women of color borrow significantly more, with Black women taking on the most substantial debt burden. As Anne Price noted earlier, we are seeing the layered impacts of barriers for women of color among millennials. And more than 70% of Black students go into debt to pay for higher education compared to 56% of white students. Some of those students who take on that debt don't even end up completing their degree. So not only do they not have the credential that will allow them to earn more, they also have student loan debt pulling them down. And that debt repayment collides with the gender wage gap and the racial wealth gap to make it even harder for them to repay their loans. Interest then accrues, further widening the debt burden. And the gender wage gap makes it even harder to pay off their share of student debt. More than 20% of college students are parents, and almost 2 million women in college are single mothers. These parents are navigating the challenging demands of college work with the demands of providing care for their children. There's so much unmet financial need that students sometimes decide not to enroll in college, or as I mentioned before, may not be able to complete. And so there are very different outcomes for children from low income and high income families, with children from high income families 6 times more likely to actually complete college by age 25 than low income children. On top of this, there is the issue of job quality. Once we do get past education and credentials, that what we mean by job quality are wages, benefits, scheduling, legal rights, equity and inclusion, opportunity to build skills in advance, supportive work environment, what Lisa Cook earlier called workplace climate, and worker voice. And while job quality is an issue within the growing service sector, regardless of gender, issues like the gender and racial wage gap, paid leave, which includes sick time, as well as family and medical leave, the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, scheduling instability, sexual harassment, all have an outsized impact on women, and particularly women of color. For example, based on a systematic review of 60 publications between 2000 and 2015 on women's career barriers in construction, which has often been touted as a destination career because of its high wages, Navarro-Astor et al. Found that the top barriers include a myriad of things, including the difficulty of balancing work and family, gender stereotypes in the industry, the lack of professionalism in construction organizations, HR. Other barriers included sexual harassment, long and inflexible working hours, high level of work stress, and lack of networks for career opportunities for women. So we need a better way to determine who is ready for college, support those who are not, so that students can succeed in the pursuit of a degree. We need to integrate programs which improve college completion for students of color that are holistic, so providing wraparound supports. But we also need to think beyond education and training and think about the actual quality of women's jobs, whether they are in sectors that are over or unrepresented in. We have a really transformational opportunity to both improve job quality and equity in job quality, and eliminate or mitigate the burdens of debt and other costs that perpetuate historically and systemically created gaps in both wages and wealth.
Thank you so very much, Sharmila. Before we move on to Chandra, and I don't see any questions in the chat yet, I just wanted to get some clarity on one aspect of what you were saying. You've spent a great part of your professional life advocating for good jobs for women. How has this conversation changed over time? How do you view this conversation changing? Or, has over the decades, do you see any differences in what's happened based on legislation?
So there have been improvements in job quality. Those have been largely localized improvements. So due to policy being passed at local or state levels, whether it be around higher minimum wage or whether it be around something like paid sick leave as well. We still have a ways to go at the federal level, however. One of the other things I would say is that issues of job quality like sexual harassment, discrimination, have, with the #MeToo movement, certainly increased the awareness. Whether or not that awareness has actually turned into action at a corporate level or again at the federal level still remains to be seen. But we have seen an increase in the number of states that have passed laws to strengthen harassment and discrimination protection. So those have both been positive things. However, as you know, good jobs encompass a lot more than those things that I've mentioned. And the pandemic has certainly raised the profile, I think, of how critical some of those infrastructure pieces that are about the care economy are truly, if we are going to have an equitable recovery and an inclusive economy.
Thank you. So let's hear from Chandra.
Hello. Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you very much for having me. At the Institute for Women's Policy Research, we focus a lot on women's economic security, women's empowerment, And we like to center women and families in the work that we do. So the research that we do, it provides not only research for us to use in our work, but also for our partners and for other advocates to use, with a special focus on women's employment, women's earnings, access to training, including apprenticeships, post-secondary education, especially for student mothers. And so the entire focus sits around access to opportunities, to addressing the gender wage gap. And that's what I would kind of like to focus on in my few minutes here. I would like to focus a little bit on the gender wage gap. That's the median earnings of all women working full-time year-round compared with men working full-time year-round, and take a brief look at the role of occupational segregation and post-secondary educational attainment in managing and maintaining, or how it is impacting both gender and racial wage and wealth gaps. So if we start in the 1960s, women working full-time year-round are being paid just 60 cents for every dollar that men were paid, for a wage gap of 40%. The wage gap remained at roughly 40% through the 1960s and 70s. In the 1980s, women's earnings began to rise, both in absolute terms and relative to men's earnings. So while women's real earnings were increasing, men's earnings were stagnating. So the gender wage gap did shrink, but for the wrong reasons. However, by 2020, women working full-time year-round were actually earning 83 cents for every dollar that men were paid. So we have a much smaller gender wage gap of 17%. Most of this decline, however, occurred during the 1980s, and there really has been only modest change in the most recent year, since 2001. And this picture gets worse if we break this down by race and ethnicity. So for example, if we compare women's earnings by race and ethnicity with those of white males, the largest group in the labor market, white women are paid 79 cents, Black women 64 cents, and Hispanic women just 57 cents for every dollar paid to their white male counterpart. It is important to note, however, that Black and Hispanic women are also paid less than their same race male counterparts. So Black women are paid less than Black men, Hispanic women less than Hispanic men. So it's important to see the role of gender in shaping earnings. Now, there are a number of factors that contribute to the gender wage gap, and this includes race and sex discrimination. For example, even when women and men do work in the same occupations, women are paid less than their male counterparts. And the higher you move in the income bracket, we find that that gender wage gap can actually increase as earnings go up. That said, we do also know that occupation and industry segregation, that tendency for men and women to work in different occupations and in different industries, accounts for just over half of the gender wage gap. So for example, in 2020, looking at men and women in different occupations, if you look at the 20 most common occupations for women, those are the occupations that employ the largest numbers of women. Only 5 of those are also among the 20 most common occupations for men. 10 of the 20 most common occupations for women are female dominated. So at least 75% of all workers in those occupations are women. And these numbers, for example, preschool and kindergarten teachers are 98.8% women. So men and women work in different occupations with different levels of earnings. The occupations that women work in tend to pay less. So that's a big factor in the gender wage gap. But it's not just that women work in different occupations and industries than men, but that many of women's most common occupations mirror the work that women have traditionally done in the home without pay. So occupations like childcare workers, maids and housekeepers, personal care aides, these are jobs that tend to be female dominated and they tend to be poorly paid. So childcare workers, for example, are paid just $542 a week for full-time work. For personal care aides, it's $537 per week. And for maids and housekeepers, it's just $497 per week. And for comparison purposes, the median weekly earnings of all women working full-time is $891 per week. And for men, it's $1,082 per week. So if we look across the 20 most common occupations for women, 6 of those would leave a family of 3 in or near poverty. And while we won't go into detail here, 74% of Black women and 46.9% of Hispanic women are breadwinners in their households, yet their gender wage gap is even worse. And again, I do want to point out as well that some of the occupations, women's most common occupations, do pay relatively well. Here, I'm thinking about elementary and middle school teachers, registered nurses, and accountants and auditors. They all have high wages, but they also tend to require a college degree, a bachelor's, or in some cases, even a master's degree. So to look briefly, we just had a great discussion about education, but to look briefly at the impact of education, it's often thought that because as educational attainment increases, wages also get better. And that's across the board. The more education you have, the higher median earnings are. So people point to education as a way to address wage inequality. However, although it is true that earnings do go up, it does not address the inequality. Those with a college education do have higher earnings. They're more likely to work in a better quality job. For example, having access to health insurance, to paid leave, to a 401k. We also know that for workers who have a college education, over the course of a career, their earnings can be $600,000 to over $1 million more than their counterparts with only a high school degree. However, we've seen women try to follow that path. So women have been increasing their levels of educational attainment, and that's women from all racial and ethnic backgrounds. So today, more women than men are graduating with a 4-year degree. And according to some recent data, the number of women 25 and older in the labor market with a 4-year degree exceeds the number of men in the labor market with a 4-year degree. Now, the pandemic may have had some impact on that, and we'll see what the long-term impacts of that are. But even with the same level of education, women are paid less than men. And this reflects a difference in the returns to education. And they're even more stark when we again break it down by race and ethnicity. So one example is Black women with a bachelor's degree have earnings similar to white men with a high school degree. Now, that doesn't take into account differences in college majors or occupation. But when we look at, for example, women and men going into male-dominated fields, and women are increasingly moving into STEM occupations, construction, as was mentioned, and we find that even within these occupations, women are still paid less. This begins right out of college with the graduate's first job, and it builds over the course of their career. So according to one analysis, women with a bachelor's degree in business over their careers can earn $1.1 million less than their male counterparts. And this is not what we might expect, given that women are increasing their levels of educational attainment. We might see that as their education goes up, excuse me, that we would see that wage gap beginning to decline, but we're not seeing that. And in addition to the differences in returns to education is the importance of understanding the impact of student loan debt on the ability of different workers to build up wealth and economic security. So for example, we know that Black women are much more likely to take out student loan debt for a number of reasons, including a lack of personal and family wealth. And having that student loan debt, it impacts the ability of these students as they enter the labor market to be able to save earnings, to build up wealth, to be able to provide for their families and for their other financial obligations. So in understanding the role of education, it's very important to understand those differences and the impact that it can have on different groups of workers. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Chandra. This was a really very interesting piece and chock full of information. But one thing that, given your introduction and given your area of expertise, that struck me is that people often talk about choice and women's choices in these situations. And whenever you mention the gender wage gap, and as you've done, demonstrated differences that exist in terms of occupational segregation or even segregation by majors, you often get the pushback that if you remove women's own personal choices, that in of itself can be a paternalistic demonstration of strength if you decide on what women ought to do. So what's your perspective on that? Could we have the best of both worlds? Could we reduce the gender wage gap while still maintaining freedom of choice in the decision that women make about their majors and their occupations?
Oh, I don't think we at all need to take away women's choices and the choices that they make. I think a lot of what people are referring to as choices are not necessarily real choices that women actually have. Part of that argument is that women want greater flexibility. They choose those jobs that allow them to balance work and family. And so they choose occupations that afford them greater affordability. And I think people are thinking of jobs like teaching, but many of the jobs that women are actually working in do not provide them with greater flexibility. They're really overrepresented in jobs like in the service sector. Those jobs are the least flexible. The hours they work, whether or not they're doing double shifts, whether they're doing split shifts, how much notice they get, those jobs actually provide less flexibility for women workers. I think another concern, another issue there that I think is really important that often gets overlooked is that many of the jobs that women do hold, again, I mentioned child care workers, I mentioned maids, a lot of the work, personal care aides, a lot of the work that women do in these occupations, the work is devalued. It's not necessarily that these jobs, that women are choosing low paying jobs. One, discrimination and other factors are a real issue. As unlike many other countries, there's less support for parents, there's less support for balancing work and family. And a lot of the jobs that are available to women, and particularly women of color, these are not necessarily jobs that they would choose, but it's jobs that are available or jobs that they have access to. So devaluation, those jobs should pay more. They should be better jobs. And to me, that would be the question about many of these jobs, rather than are women choosing low wage jobs, but why are these jobs low wage? Why are women or anyone working full-time year round having earnings too low to be able to support a family? So I don't necessarily see it as taking away women's choices, but actually increasing women's choices.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much for that, Chandra. And Ben, over to you to wrap up the three discussants.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be a part of such a great conversation on this panel. My name is Ben Giddis. I'm at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and Bipartisan Policy Center's mission is to advance policies in a bipartisan way. And it's our belief that it is really one of the surest ways to get long-lasting, durable policy change that improves people's lives. So I'm going to talk about specifically how caregiving impacts women's careers, particularly early in their careers, and the role that paid family leave can play in helping to address those challenges. Well, to start, caregiving has two related forces that end up impacting careers at the start of someone's, at the very beginning. So the first is that caregiving challenges that arise themselves result in significant job disruptions for women. When without support like paid family leave or other workplace flexibility benefits, caregiving can result in women leaving their job altogether for months or years at a time. And when they return, they end up being behind their male counterparts pretty significantly. The other thing that happens, and Chandra touched on this in her talk, is caregiving can influence the types of jobs that women value and pursue. Considerable research does demonstrate that women tend to value jobs that have greater flexibility, better benefits, job security, all the qualities that would support caregiving over jobs that are more demanding and tend to be higher paying. And so between these two factors, women face the job disruptions and they end up in careers that have more of those flexibility, but tend to be less paying. So at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we recognize that these issues related to caregiving played a pretty significant role over the last 18 months, perhaps no larger, at no time has it been a bigger issue. And so than during the pandemic. So we did a poll, a series of surveys to try to understand how much was caregiving impacting workers and how much it was, and what the role of paid family leave could be in helping them get back to the workforce. So here were some of our findings. In May, we did a survey. In May 2021, we did a survey and found that roughly the equivalent of about 10 million workers stopped working during the pandemic, at least in part due to caregiving. And of those who stopped working, 3.4 million to 4.6 million didn't look for work, which meant that they left the labor force altogether. Caregiving can also, it doesn't just influence somebody's decision to work or not to work, it could also influence how much somebody decides to work. So during the pandemic, we found that about 11.7 million workers reduced the number of hours that they're working in a given week because of caregiving. And then the issues of caregiving, preventing people from being able to balance family and work, that all started from the very start of the pandemic. We did a survey of workers on unemployment insurance back in June 2020 to better understand what were the challenges they were facing in getting back to work. And caregiving was certainly one thing that popped out. So we found that 26% of people who were receiving unemployment insurance, which at the time was roughly 8 million workers, primarily spent their time caregiving rather than looking for work. And that included 59% of parents who are on unemployment insurance. And that's pretty noteworthy because when someone is on unemployment insurance, the program is typically designed to help people return to work and often requires recipients to be looking for work. But clearly caregiving was playing a major factor during the pandemic with childcare centers closed, schools closed, and it made it very difficult for people to go back to work. So now turning the page to paid family leave. Paid family leave by its design really provides an important tool to help caregivers and women stay in the labor force, continue their careers, and really advance their labor market outcomes. So, and it can be kind of counterintuitive because by its very definition, someone is leaving their job when they go on paid leave. But what happens is, rather than leaving their job permanently, they keep their job and they leave rather than months or years at a time, they leave for 8 to 12 weeks and then they go back to their job. And this has been found in California, which has had a paid family leave program for about 15 years to support, particularly for new mothers, support their job continuity and labor force attachment and outcomes. And so not only does it would a paid family leave prevent those disruptions in the labor market, but the United States, which does not have a federal paid family leave program, having one would also empower more women to make choices that Chandra was talking about. If women have the ability, they know they have the ability to go on leave and take the time they need to care for their family and male caregivers as well, then folks would be more willing to go for and more able to pursue jobs that would be more demanding and higher pay. And then likewise, during the pandemic, Bipartisan Policy Center, we conducted polls to better understand how paid family leave could help people go back to work today, knowing that workers are facing such immense caregiving challenges during the pandemic. So one of the things we found was that of those who did get paid family leave, which in the United States is a minority, only about 23% of people who of workers have a paid family leave benefit from their employer. So we found that 71% of workers who had paid family leave said that it made it easier for them to continue to work. So it helped them balance family and work. The other thing we found is that paid family leave would help people go back to work. those who are currently out of the workforce would it be help them go back to work. So we found that over 1/3, 37% of unemployed workers would go back to work sooner if they had a paid family leave benefit. And that included nearly half, or 45%, of unemployed caregivers. So just kind of summarize what I've been saying, caregiving really does provide challenges to caregivers, parents, and mothers before the pandemic, resulting in career disruptions, influencing career choices and career paths. And it also, during the pandemic, was a huge disruptor for many workers in the labor force. And paid family leave could be an important tool to help people get back to work and continue their careers.
Thank you very much, Ben. I find it rather interesting that in your conversation about paid family leave, you spoke about between 8 and 12 weeks of family leave, which can often prevent you from leaving the labor force for up to years at a time. So my question is, I mean, how do you reconcile that with what's happening right now on the Hill, where we're actually even talking about 4 weeks of paid family leave? I mean, is this going to be effective?
Well, so what we're seeing on the Hill is that the paid family leave proposal that was put forward by the Build Back Better Act has been slimmed down in order to fit into current budgetary constraints in the reconciliation effort. And so I think this speaks to a couple of things. First, it highlights, at Bipartisan Policy Center, we generally believe that reconciliation isn't the best vehicle to make huge policy change, simply because there are limitations on what you're able to do. And if we're looking at, to your question, Nicole, 4 weeks for something like paid parental leave to care for a new child often won't be enough for folks. So if lawmakers are looking to slim down the bill, at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we put out a few recommendations. One is they could focus on paid parental leave, which does have broad bipartisan support to care for a new child when someone is a newborn or when there's adoption. And that would not only make the cost of the program about 1/3, but you could have a much more generous benefit that provides adequate, provides the adequate support that folks need. And I think folks would be more confident that would have longer lasting, bipartisan buy-in for it, even if it does go on a political vehicle. The other thing is that we've thought about is just simply because there are so many budgetary constraints, is lawmakers could think about targeting the benefit to lower income, lower wage workers. We know that, in paid family leave in the private sector, it's the lower wage, low income workers who are the ones who really lack any access to paid leave. Only about 1/3 of workers with family incomes below $30,000 are able to take any type of paid leave when they have a new child or need to care for a family member. And those numbers grow to 66% or 83% for middle or higher income workers. And so focusing on those lower income workers who don't have things like paid sick leave, vacation days, any form of PTO that other workers have would really directly expand access to paid leave for those who really need it.
Absolutely, thank you. And we have a few questions from the audience, but I guess I'm really intrigued by our last speaker again. So I'm going to just push Ben on one more question before we talk about some of the audience directions. But Ben, I was wondering if in discussing, because you gave us some really interesting statistics about the impact of an 8 to 12 week paid family leave, have you tried to measure the net impact on the overall economy? I mean, when the dust settles, where do we end up? Because we could prevent people from being out of the labor force for years. So it's almost like measuring a counterfactual. Do you or your group or anyone else, do you know, has tried to measure what's the net impact of this on the economy?
So specifically for paid parental leave, putting all the other issues aside, in reconciliation because of the labor force benefits that it keeps people attached to the workforce, keeps people, boosts our labor supply, which is one of the most important factors of economic growth. It's believed that paid parental leave would support economic growth. We don't have a specific number on it, but there have been numerous studies showing, like in California, I believe that new mothers were about 10% more likely to continue their jobs if they were able to take paid parental leave versus those who weren't. And so by keeping more workers in the labor force, that does have a net positive effect on the economy.
Chandra, there's been a lot of interest in your statistics, and some of the audience members would like to know if you would be able to share some of the data and numbers that you refer to in your talk.
Sure. The sources of the data that I use, some of it is it's other reports that are available. So I'm not quite sure how we want to get that out to people, but I would be more than happy to share with my data sources that can then be passed on to those who signed up for the conference.
No, in terms of your comments that you made, did you write those down? Do you have, or were you just ad-libbing based on your knowledge? Because if they're written down, we can share that for the audience as well. So just curious.
For some of the numbers, so for example, and I'm not quite sure which numbers that you're specifically asking about, but in terms of, for example, the weekly earnings for workers, that comes directly from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They have CPS tables where they will break earnings down by detailed occupations for men and women, as well as the numbers of workers. So specifically, the BLS CPS tables 11 and 39 are two specifically. I mean, that's what I'm saying is I could send it out. Some of the other research, some of the Georgetown research on, so there's a report, Women Can't Win. Some of the data is data that we have analyzed at IWPR. The data on Black women, for example, is recent data that I analyzed for Black Women's Equal Pay Day earlier this year. So that's, it's data. We actually have it. We have a fact sheet on IWPR's website. So that includes some of that data. So I'm not quite sure the specific factors that they're looking for.
So let's just share the general, and if they need anything else specific, they can, maybe contact you through your organization.
And the data's on the gender wage gap. A lot of that each year, IWPR updates our gender wage gap briefing paper, and that's on the website. There's several of them. They're broken down by weekly wages. There's one we do with the annual wages are released. My colleague Ariane Hegevish, she is if you go and click on her name and her publications, you will get a wealth of information on the gender wage gap. And she updates it religiously every time new data comes out. So those would be some of the places I would say to definitely reach out to IWPR, and we can definitely we have so much data. The mention of women in construction. This year we've done a lot of research around getting women into construction, and some of that, it comes from focus group interviews that we did with women across the country. Some of it's a study of New Orleans, where we go in and talk with professionals in the New Orleans area to see how we can begin to increase capacity to get women into apprenticeships. So we have a team that works simply on student parents. So there is a huge amount of data on student parents and their access to higher education, the cost, student loan debt, all of that work is there. So I did draw from a number of different sources that I've cited for different pieces of that. So it just kind of depends. I did draw on a number of different sources for that piece.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Shamili, I have a few questions that I think might be great for you to respond to. This is coming from the audience as well. And the first of this is, what types of programs exist to help combat job segregation and encourage employers to recruit women and people of color?
So it depends on the industry. I think that kind of like we have, there's a lot of difference. And so kind of, I think Chandra just referenced, all of the work that's happening around construction and trades. And there's a Chicago Women in Trades here is a seminal organization that does work both locally, but also very importantly, nationally on reducing segregation in construction and trades. I think has been a partner with IWPR, has been a partner with Equal Rights Advocates. We've certainly worked with them on increasing apprenticeships, decreasing barriers of all kinds, ensuring that training and certifications are available and accessible to women as well. I think that part of what we are addressing, right, is that sometimes there is an effort to get women into higher paying jobs by looking at male dominated industries, which are the ones that tend to be higher paid. And part of addressing job segregation is making sure that we are not just relegating those sectors that are dominated by women to being lower paid, lower quality jobs. So just as much as we should be investing in those programs that seek to create more diverse, equitable, and inclusive industries that are more male dominated, we also have to be doing the same for those that are dominated by women and ensure that those jobs are increased in quality, are increased in terms of their compensation. I think there are efforts both at the federal level and at the local level looking, for example, at early childhood workforce and ensuring that early childhood professionals are paid well, given that they are caring and educating some of the people most precious to all of us, right? So, so I think that those are kind of, there are different approaches depending on the industry that we're speaking of and what that segregation actually looks like.
I'm going to follow up with another question, which I think both you and Chandra might want to take a stab at. So I'm gonna ask you first, and then Chandra later to also chime in on this question. And it comes from the audience that says, I have a student intern who will graduate with her master's degree and over $100,000 in student loans. She's a single mother, older student, and no real family supports. She has no idea how she will pay this off. What would you recommend for her?
It's tough because that individual anecdote, that story is so representative of multiple failures within our systems and then the lack of supports as well. I mean, I think that there isn't one solution to that, right? I think one of the first things that we have to look at is whether or not we're talking about this individual. We need to look at student loan debt and stop talking about it as though it's good debt. Because for far too many people, particularly women of color, but even beyond, student loan debt is not good debt because it is not paired with any kind of generational wealth. And because the industries that are requiring the degrees are also not ones that are compensating at a level that would make that debt something that could be ameliorated in any quick order as well. So I think that those are a couple of things. I do think that for folks who don't have parental support or don't have kind of what we see with higher income families, right? Those connections, it's the who you know. that that professors, educators, I'm assuming in this case, do have an opportunity to provide that as well. Like, we need to make sure that those who don't have supports that might come with having generational wealth have those supports built into their educational experience, right? And so that may be something that this person can do, is help that person network so that they can get a foothold in a career that hopefully has some advancement associated with it. What starts off as a good job is not the same thing as what may be a good career. And so that opportunity for advancement is really critical. Chandra?
Any comments, Chandra?
And that is a hard one, which is what really makes this such a problem is, you know, as Shamili said, it's such a common issue that where women, or not just women, where people find themselves. And I would echo that argument about considering all student debt good debt and not having a clear, we know that this can get so complex depending on the type of university you attend, whether you're able to complete it and so forth. And other than, you know, what Sharmili said about helping the student network and find that good, you know, find a good job, maybe even looking for jobs that will, you know, help pay off student loan debt. And I'm not quite sure how widespread that is or what opportunities look like there. But for students that are already in that situation, I don't know that I have any answers or solutions. The only thing I can say is it becomes ever more important to really demand policy changes around the way we finance education, who has access to it, and again, the differential impact that has on different groups of students. And it is those that have the least support systems that are being saddled with the greatest amount of debt because they have fewer resources to draw on. But yeah, I don't know that I have a good solution for that either.
And I'm not even sure, you know, Congress has a good solution, which is why we keep spinning our wheels on what to do about student loan debt. But just as a comment that I can make here myself, it's really important to counsel our students ahead of time before they saddle themselves with this type of debt on what they take, where they could eventually end up. Shamili was talking about the difference between a good job and a good career. That is absolutely essential for us to know, because you need to know ahead of time that there's a connection between what you take and what you make, and what level of education you earn and what you could potentially earn, and where you can end up with your job. So it's important to at least have that information and have transparent conversations with our students ahead of time before you saddle them with this type of burden for the rest of their lives.
Nicole, can I just add really quickly that it's also really important that private student loans are regulated, that there are far too many instances of private student loan debt just creating a debt burden that is crushing, absolutely crushing. And some of these loan servicers are preying on students, right? They're preying on and providing predatory loans because often these are people who are taking out loans who don't have those supports and who may not know the details of what they are committing to. And those details are not made easy to understand or easily accessible, those kinds of things. So, in Illinois, we passed a student loan bill of rights. I know that's been the case in other places across the country, but we also have to look at that piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. I have a question for Ben. Here, I think the audience wants to know if you can talk a little bit about the Great Resignation that we're seeing for women? Which industries are they leaving? Where are they going? Do you have any comment on all of the quits and the leaves that we've been seeing and the extent to which women are leading those movements?
So I think what we're seeing a lot of are the symptoms of having a labor supply problem. So the labor market right now is very hot. The unemployment rate is very low. Job openings are through the roof. People are quitting because they have the ability to quit and find another job. And folks just have more options. Now, why do we have labor supply problems? Why isn't labor force participation catching back up? And I think it's somewhat of a mystery, but there are a lot of, I think pretty credible theories. First is look at labor force participation, and it plummeted in April 2020 and has not rebounded. And it's clearly one thing is a big symptom of the pandemic and all the challenges that have come with the pandemic, including, back to harp on what I've been talking about, is caregiving. And a lot of folks are really facing significant caregiving challenges, both care for ill family members, before schools reopened, having to care for children at home. And that made it extremely difficult to, balance work and family. The other things that are happening are there's just general fear of the virus. Every couple of weeks, the census puts out a pulse survey how folks are doing, and every couple of weeks we learn that a few million people are just simply not working because they're afraid of the virus. And so so it's really important, I think, first of all, for the country to finally get past this pandemic, which is clearly easier said than done, if we want any hopes of really getting in our labor market and folks back to wanting to work and wanting to accept a job in person. And then we have to look at policies that really help support people transition back to those jobs. So paid family leave is an obvious one that can help people balance family and work. There are other things like workforce development programs, helping people transition to careers and new jobs. The previous conversation talked a lot about student debt. One of the issues is there's a lot of jobs in this country that have, the high pay. They require a bachelor's degree. There aren't as many opportunities to pursue a rewarding, high-paying career that doesn't involve going to get a 4-year degree. And so we need to take a hard look at, how do we provide new alternative ways for folks to really build careers in technical areas without having to pay a lot for a bachelor's degree. And so those types of issues, and then taking a close look at the safety net. Our unemployment insurance system was pretty crippled before going into the pandemic, and clearly it took on a lot of folks. One of the goals, as I mentioned, of unemployment insurance is to get people back to work, but there isn't enough investment in reemployment services and workforce training that's integrated into unemployment insurance to help people get back to work. So there's a lot going on, and there isn't any single core issue going on here, but the first things first is getting past this pandemic.
I have a question for Shamali based on something she'd said earlier. In your definition of wealth, you spoke about opportunities to generate wealth, and you even spoke about it from the perspective of genuine self-sufficiency for an individual. But how do you see this connecting with intergenerational wealth? I mean, have you, in your research, considered what it means for the next generation? Are there any specific programs that try to address some of the generational problems we've been seeing, with respect to families not having access to a good education, not necessarily having access to good jobs that can help them move to the next generation? Is this a concern for your group?
Oh, definitely. I think it's definitely a concern. I do think that the the racial wealth gap in particular is so wide and was created in such institutionalized and systemic ways that it is not something we are going to get out of through individual action by any means. It is going to require broad public policy efforts in addition to institutional reform in order to address the gap that was created. It was an intentionally created gap. And there are many ways in which it is continued that, you know, in terms of how homes that are owned by people of color are appraised. When the same home is thought to be owned by a white family versus a family of color, and the fact that there is a gap there, we cannot diminish or minimize the impact of that institutionalized and systemic discrimination when it comes to generational wealth gap. And that's why it is going to take bold moves at a broad level to address them. Having said that, I think one of the things that we focus on, as Chandra does, and we rely a great deal on IWPR's research for this, is really looking at the gender wage gap and understanding it to be a driver of the wealth gap, right? So if you are being, not only if you are being underpaid, we often talk about it being as 17 cents on the dollar or 20 cents on the dollar, or, you know, significantly more if you are Black or Latinx. That all accumulates. And over 40 years, we are talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, upwards of $1 million. So when you're thinking about generational wealth, we are talking about $400,000 to over $1 million over a woman's career that she does not have access to, that she is not able to use to make decisions about home ownership, retirement, being able to pay for her child's college education, managing medical crises, you know, all of those things that essentially are robbed, right, because of the gender wage gap. And so if you look at the gender wage gap and understand it to be a driver of not only a single generation's wealth gap, but intergenerational wealth, I think we see a place that we can intervene in a very meaningful and impactful way. I think some of the policies that we've also discussed already, paid family medical leave being one of them, but also things like the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, where we still have institutionalized holding women back, holding people in caregiving roles back from being able to even be at the same playing field as so many others.
We have another question from the audience, and I'm gonna leave this open to all panelists and you can decide who wants to answer it. But the question is, what is the impact of unionization on bringing pay equity in the workplace, particularly in blue collar and construction jobs? Does anyone wanna take that?
I can speak a little bit to that. One of the things we know is that among unionized workers, the wage gap is smaller than it is for non-union workers. And a big piece of that, a big piece of what unions do is because the whole wage setting process is a public process. It's that you don't wind up with these wide gaps. You don't wind up, and especially when we think about in these blue collar occupations. Now, there's not one set effect of all unions, but I know in some of the women that we have spoken to, in some instances, having that union when there is a problem, for example, on a job site, or being able to turn to that union and have that union advocate on your behalf, that's also a piece of that puzzle. It's not just having a smaller wage gap, but one problem, especially again with women in these male-dominated fields, is even when you get women in, they don't stay. So they're not able to build up over time and develop and grow. But having that union can provide an opportunity to give them the support that they need to remain in those fields so that they can begin to climb and see some professional growth and development. So unions can have a really healthy impact. We also see that with public sector workers who are unionized, where you've got smaller wage gaps. So I think unions can have a very positive impact on closing those wage gaps and in increasing women's access to the benefits of those well-paying occupations.
Thank you, Ben. I think I'm going to direct this one to you. Besides paid parental leave, should we also establish a daddy quota like in Sweden, where if the father didn't take a month off work, then the couple as a whole would lose a month's paid leave? Otherwise, we might have the same issue as the current FMLA, where one gender takes the main responsibility. Any thoughts?
Well, I think there is something to be said about tying leave to the household and coordinating leave taking across parents. I do think, we talk about choice. I think what would be the surest way to getting, folks buy-in for paid leave and really supporting folks in the workforce is to ensure that people do have the choices to make and allowing families to, choose what is best for them in terms of who's taking the leave. And I do also want to raise the mention the FMLA. There are concerns about who takes leave and who is, what are the implications of that for families and workforce outcomes. One of the things that often isn't discussed is that the Family and Medical Leave Act, it only applies to about 60% of the workforce, and not very little paid leave legislation addresses expanding that so it reaches more workers, particularly those in smaller businesses. So what the Family and Medical Leave Act does is it gives somebody the ability to keep their job with their employer, and it guarantees their ability to go on 12 weeks, although it's unpaid, guarantees their ability to take that time and be able to go back to their job. But not everyone has that ability to go back to their job. And so if there's a paid leave, federal paid leave initiative, that should come parallel with finding some way to expand job protection so it reaches more workers. Because if we're providing paid leave without the ability for folks to go back to, without giving enough folks the ability to go back to work, that could limit the impact of the benefit.
Thank you. So I have a question here, which I think might be directed towards Chandra. How do you think expansion of public service loan forgiveness program would help women? Do you think if we expand the public service loan forgiveness that it will directly affect women? Would it force women into public service jobs more often than not? And would there be some trade-off over time?
With the public service, one, I know there are a lot of issues with people trying to actually benefit from the public service loan forgiveness. So that becomes one issue. People have invested in that as a way to address their debt, but then I know a lot of people, after having made these career choices and decisions, then wind up facing issues actually being able to access that benefit. So I think that's an important piece that definitely needs to be addressed. I would definitely not say that the expansion of public service loan forgiveness is a bad thing or not a good thing. I just think we need something larger and more comprehensive to address the student loan debt issue, especially, and going back to the question that you asked me initially about allowing women to make their own career choices. And, by addressing that issue, the larger issue of student loan debt, which is going to have to be addressed, I think that we definitely need something larger and more comprehensive beyond just the service, the public service student loan forgiveness program. And we definitely have to address the way that we pay for education in the first place, even before so that we don't wind up with that particular issue.
Thank you, Chandra. And I think we only have enough time for maybe just one more question. So I'm going to address this question to Shamili, because I think it's, I heard it a lot in some of the talk that she gave initially. Would you recommend a minimum wage for women's work? Because there seems to be a concern that there's a lot of work that women do that we don't pay well enough. And I just wonder if there should be some sort of legislation advocating for a minimum wage across the board for some of these traditionally women dominated jobs. And what's your opinion on that?
I mean, I don't know that I would focus specifically on just women dominated sectors, because I think that even within, as has been talked about, even within sectors that are male dominated, women are often paid less, within those sectors. So the issue of compensation for women's labor is not limited to sectors that are dominated by women. So that's one thing. I think there's also, an interesting conversation, I think, that's to be had around care work that is unpaid care work and then paid care work as well, right? And how is it that we place value on care work that is not someone's job per se, but we know that the caregiving burden and responsibility in American households is largely carried by women. So how do we value that? How do employers value that in terms of how they treat women or caregivers who are employees? For example, some companies provide a child care allowance as part of what they do. And I think that is a way of acknowledging the value of care work, even if it's not your actually paid work. I do think that there is an important conversation to be had about the minimum wage. However, overall, Congress has been working on the Raise the Wage Act, which would raise the federal minimum wage, which has not been raised in quite some time. And it would also eliminate the other piece that I've talked about, which is the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, which is a largely, tipped workers are largely women of color, and working in industries like the restaurant industry, but also in nail salons, wheelchair attendants, valet parkers. I mean, the tipped workers is a very large group of workers who are currently legally paid less than the minimum wage. So I think that there's an argument to be made for the minimum wage to just be the minimum wage. And that is actually not the case right now. We have significant groups of workers who are paid less than the minimum. So that includes tipped workers. It includes, in some cases, youth workers, people with disabilities at times, incarcerated workers. There's a way in which calling it the minimum wage is almost a misnomer because of how many workers are not eligible for it right now.
Well, thank you, everyone. I would like to thank the panel for a really lively discussion. It's really exciting. I'm just going to end by saying, on examining the minimum wage, we would leave the discussion on inflation to the macroeconomists, or possible inflation to those. But thank you so very much, Ben Giddis, Chandra Childers, and Sharmili Majmudar for a really great discussion. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. We will be taking a 5-minute break and we will resume right after that. Thank you.